Well, I sat down the other day and I decided to watch the movie Big, because that's a movie that I had only seen sort of very vaguely as a kid and I hadn't seen in years, and people tell me it's like one of the best sort of comedy, romance, kids type films from the 80s out there, and another great performance by Tom Hanks, one of my absolute favourite actors there. So I decided for the first time to sort of properly sit down and watch it. And this is a good film. This is a really sort of good film that kind of mixes a lot of interesting kind of ideas of comedy with fantasy, and a little bit of a romantic comedy element in there. You don't tend to think of romantic comedies having any kind of fantasy element to them, but this one actually does. Now, the basic premise, if you haven't seen the film, I do kind of question why you're watching a review of it, but whatever. Basically, this kid is getting frustrated because, not so much because he's young, but because he's small. He's too small to get on a ride, so he makes a wish on a machine at the fairground, I guess just for a bit of fun, really. He doesn't actually sort of genuinely think it's going to work. He just wishes he was big. He doesn't necessarily wish he's grown up, he just wishes he's big. But I guess the machine sort of interprets that as wishing he was grown up, because he wakes up the next morning as a grown-up, played by Tom Hanks. And this is a really impressive performance by Tom Hanks, because obviously, essentially, he's playing a kid for the whole film. He has to go and find another job, because obviously nobody knows who he is. Even his own mum doesn't recognise him. He tries to convince her that he's him, but she doesn't believe him. He has to go to New York. He has to basically adjust to life as an adult. So this is Tom Hanks sort of playing, kind of trying to pretend to be an adult, but also at the same time essentially being a kid. It's kind of a difficult role for him, and I always thought Forrest Gump was his best performance. I think actually this might be a better performance from him. This is really impressive, the way he's sort of playing a kid but sort of not playing a kid at the same time. Is really kind of a difficult role to pull off. Now, of course, obviously there's the story of him obviously trying to resort back to being a kid. Essentially, he's got to find this machine again. I forget what it's called. Should have looked that up. Zorlax. Began with Z, I know that much. There's a chain of these around, and he asks for some kind of report or document telling him where he can find these machines so he can make another wish to make himself a kid again. He just has to wait for 6 weeks and basically just live as an adult that whole time, but obviously, essentially at the same time, he is also a kid, and he actually gets a job that does benefit him as a kid, him being a kid, because he has to look at toys. I feel there was a bit of a flaw in the fact that he's portrayed as being this kid who, is obsessed with toys and just going around and having fun. But the character he's actually supposed to be about 13. I think maybe that's a bit too old for that kind of character. I would have thought a kid maybe of about 8 would have been more appropriate for that kind of personality. I have heard some criticism of this film that the adult Josh, the kid's called, the adult Josh and the young Josh, their personalities don't match up. We don't actually know the young Josh very well. We only see him for 10 minutes at the beginning, and then very, very briefly at the end. I don't know how we can really say with any kind of confidence that their personalities don't match up, but certainly Tom Hanks' personality, the adult Josh's personality, does seem more appropriate to a younger kid than 13 to me. That's maybe a minor flaw. Obviously, there's the famous giant piano scene where they play music on that, and apparently that was not altered. That was just the raw footage of them actually playing that tune on the piano. So that's really impressive. That's just an enjoyable scene to watch on its own. Even if you never want to see the film, that scene on its own, you can probably find it on YouTube somewhere. That's a really enjoyable scene to watch. And then a little bit of a romance that he gets involved with this woman, and by the end, obviously, he has to face this decision. Does he remain an adult so that he can make this woman happy, or does he have to go back to being a kid? And of course he has to really go back to being a kid, because as an adult, he's leaving behind a heck of a lot of people. There's that kind of moral issue. Perhaps, he would have been happier with this woman. Perhaps she would have been happier with him. But he can't abandon his family, he can't abandon his friends. He has to go back to being a kid, and obviously he is essentially still a kid, so he has to continue to live his life like that. The ending, though, that's probably my only real major problem with this film. that left a few questions unanswered for me. I have to question, whether people would just sort of welcome him back and say, oh, hello, yeah, you're back, and then just get on with their lives. Does nobody sort of think to question him where he's been this whole time, and what exactly happened? At some point, Josh would have had to have actually told them the truth about what really happened. Would they have believed him? Probably not, but he could probably have proved it by just going to one of the machines and simply, testing it out and saying, look, this machine actually does grant wishes. They should probably get rid of those machines, because that's actually pretty dangerous if you don't actually know that they grant wishes for real. And there should probably be like some kind of warning on the machine, this actually does grant wishes, He creates this story while he's an adult about how he's been kidnapped, and at one point he actually talks to his mum on the phone, and he actually pretends to be the kidnapper. Do the police, maybe want to investigate this at all? I mean, again, I think Josh will probably have to just simply tell them the truth in the end, because otherwise they're going to be going around searching for a kidnapper that doesn't exist. And obviously there's the fact that the adult Josh has essentially disappeared now, so he has to go probably back to the people in New York and explain to them what has happened and why he's disappeared. So yeah, there are a lot of loose ends at the end of this film that are not tied up, but I've kind of tied them up just there, I think, without too much difficulty, just making a few assumptions. So maybe the writers just sort of felt, this is essentially a family film, we need to make it relatively short. You can probably figure out what happens by the end, but I would have liked some kind of confirmation or establishment that Josh essentially just told them what really happened. I would have liked some kind of confirmation of that in some kind of epilogue. But aside from that, a good film, a great performance by Tom Hanks, a really kind of interesting idea. What would it be like just to be an adult for a week or so, or even just a day? It's every kid's fantasy, and maybe it's sort of sending the message that maybe just sort of suddenly being an adult, it's actually quite a lot of responsibility, Don't jump in too quickly, because I remember I sort of had that fantasy for a long time when I was a kid, wouldn't it be so much better just to be an adult? I mean, for one thing, you don't have to go to school, it's actually a lot more difficult than you might think. So yeah, that was Big. Overall, I'd say probably about a 4 out of 5 film. Good film, not an absolute masterpiece. I'm not sure if I'd go as far to say it's a personal favourite of mine, but it was a good film. Okay, see ya.